Thank you. Hey, thanks everybody for coming out. I know it's very cold and you braved the cold to come out. And if you didn't brave the cold to come up and you're online, that's great too. Yeah, I'm really excited to come here and speak to everyone. It's a real honor and thrill for me to be here to share some of my PhD dissertation research with you guys, which actually happened 10 years ago. It's kind of hard to believe, but I studied pollination in the genus Dalea. This is Dalea purpurea, the purple prairie clover, which is common in tall grass prairies. We'll see more of it later, but I just wanted to highlight that this sweat bee here, look at what she's doing. She's actually actively digging the pollen out of the anthers. And you can see, those are her hind legs, right? That orange pollen is getting deposited onto her hind legs. So that's pretty cool. And I think it just, even the photo alone kind of tells you something about what's going on here. Okay, so here's the structure of my talk. First, I want to provide some background about generalist versus specialist pollination systems in general, so to speak. So let me understand why this topic is interesting and why I was interested in the topic. I'll also introduce a little bit more about the genus Dalea in this section as well. After that, we're going to see two sections where I discuss some research that I did into this topic. First, in the tall grass prairies in Missouri, where that Dalea purpurea that I showed you was, the purple prairie clover. And then we'll come to the Sky Islands in Arizona, not too far from here. That's where this photo is taken, actually, the Sky Islands. And so we'll kind of bring it back to this region at the very end. Okay, so let's start with that first section here, and I'm going to take you to the tall grass prairie. This is the background section. And let's go to the tall grass prairie in Missouri here. And while you're looking at this image, I would like for you to take a couple seconds. How many different types of flowers do you see? Different colors, shapes, sizes, all that kind of stuff. Take a second. How many do you see? And why do you think there are so many different kinds? Okay, cool. Does anybody want to be bold and say why do you think there are so many different kinds of flowers? What would be your prediction or hypothesis? Pollinators. Hey, I like that. You know who else thought that? Charles Darwin thought that as well. Charles Darwin, this is Darwin's orchid, okay? And this species was given to Charles Darwin in 1862 by an orchid grower. It's native to Madagascar. Charles Darwin had never actually been there, okay? But someone grew the orchid and gave it to him, and he noted that, it has this super long nectar tube thingy here. And so he said, okay, it's probably pollinated by a moth with a really long tongue. That's what would explain this. So Charles Darwin also thought, okay, well, maybe this weird flower has to do with its pollinator, right? And incredibly, so that was in 1862. Incredibly, he was right. It wasn't until 20 years after his death, in 1907, that this moth with this super long tongue was actually discovered. And then even later than that, not till 1992, was when this moth was actually observed pollinating the flower in the wild. Okay, so this is a very specialized pollination system, right? Let's stick with specialized pollination system. Now let's go to the Andes, cloud forest in the Andes Mountains here. And here we have a bat and a plant, and the plant is in the bellflower family, the Campanulaceae. And whoa, you might want to look right around there. I mean, this is incredible. You talk about specialized pollination system. This bat has a super, super long tongue. Let's just kind of watch it again here. Look at that. I mean, that's incredible. We'll watch it one more round here. What I want you to see, that's where the pollen is, right? And see how when the bat reaches all the way down, then it ends up brushing the bat's back right there in a very specific place. Okay, one last time with this. There you go. Look at that. How long is the tongue? It's 150% the length of its body. Okay, so this is a super long tongue. Put it to you this way: if you're 6 feet tall, then you would have a 9-foot tongue. I mean, where do you even put that thing, right? Okay, when you're drinking nectar, it makes sense, but then you got to retract it. In fact, the bat even has a modified rib cage for when it is retracting the tongue, because it has to store it someplace, right? So this is really incredible, and beyond just being incredible, it's cool because once again, we can understand, why does the bat have the long tongue? Why does the plant have the long floral tube like this? Well, we're kind of making the argument that there's a relationship between the traits that plants and pollinators have and the pollination system, right? just like kind of like our prediction, kind of like what Charles Darwin was predicting with that moth too. So far, so good. But there's always a but, right? But there's a little bit of a problem, or things get a little bit more complicated, right? Those examples I showed you are exceptional examples. That's not really the norm. Those are like the examples that would get you interviewed on NPR Science Friday or something like that, right? But when you go out in nature, most plant pollinator relationships aren't so specific like that. And in fact, if we look at some of these networks, we say what plant species is connected to what pollinator species and vice versa. A lot of times they look like this. I'll kind of walk you through it here. So this blue flower is linked to this bee here. That's the only thing. So this flower is specialized, right? It's only pollinated by one thing, right? But this bee is a generalist, right? This bee pollinates this flower and this flower and this flower. And that's a kind of a pattern that we see a lot of times with generalists linked to specialists and vice versa. Actually in a lot of different ecosystems. Back in the early 2000s, people looked at this in the tropics, in Mediterranean type climates, in the Arctic, and they kind of found similar patterns no matter where they went. And so this is the reason, the logic behind this type of relationship is the idea that this network structure is going to be more robust. What I mean is that if you have specialists linked to specialists, then if something happens to that bat or something happens to that moth, then the plant's going down with it, right? And vice versa. But if you have a relationship like this, the specialist is linked to the generalist. Well, if something happens to this plant, this bee will be fine, or if something happens to this bee, this plant will be fine because it's got some backup plants, basically. That's the kind of logic behind it. Okay, so that makes sense, but it complicates our initial question. I used to, you look at this, at first we're thinking, okay, well, there's probably the different colors and shapes and sizes have to do with the pollinators. But if you were standing here with me when I took this photo, you might see the same bee go to this flower, to this one, to this one, to this one, and you might have this asymmetric relationship between generalists and specialists. And suddenly it's not so easy to make the claim or to understand why we see what we see. So with that in mind, we can pose two questions. First off, just what is the relationship between floral traits and their pollination system? Probably there is some relationship, but probably most of the time it's not going to be so clear like in those dramatic examples I first showed you. And then kind of along with that, if you are going to have generalists and specialists, what is the advantage and disadvantage of each system? Why would you want to be a generalist? Why would you want to be a specialist? That kind of thing. So these are the questions that I was really interested in. That brings us to Dalea. Dalea is a great system, a great genus for asking these questions because we can see two very different floral forms in the genus Dalea. Some of them have what I'm going to call the specialist form, like Dalea formosa. This is the typical floral form that you see in a legume, like if you see like peas in your garden or lupinus, lupin or something like that. They have this floral form, which is, you would think it might be specialist because the petals are enclosing the anthers and the stigma, the anthers where the pollen is, and all that kind of thing. Okay. But then there's another floral form, Dalea albiflora, which might be more generalist because the anthers, we can see the anthers in yellow here where the pollen is, and the stigma, the style, that's all exposed. So maybe anything could access the nectar that's in the center of the flower. Anyone could access the pollen too. Okay, so that's one really cool thing about Dalea. That's why I picked this genus to study for my PhD. There's another reason why. And that is geography. You know what I had fun doing over the last week? I went on to GBIF, which is a biodiversity database, and I took locality data for all the Dalea species I could get that I could get my hands on. And I color coded them based on this. Okay, so this generalist open floral form is in orange, and the specialist floral form is in blue. Whoa, that's quite the pattern. That's quite the striking pattern there. I should mention, by the way, Dalea is a genus that's distributed in the Americas, about 200 species or so, probably more. But there's this really cool difference in the distribution of the two different floral forms. Would you like to take a little tour of Dalea with me around the map? Okay, well, you have no choice, so we're gonna do it. Okay, sweet. So let's start in the north. Okay, so here we have Dalea ornata. Okay, this is a Dalea species. It's got that open generalist floral form, and it can be found in kind of arid lands. It's been studied by James Kane. So this is pollinated by lots of different kinds of bees. It's really used in rangeland restoration as well. A lot of Dalea species are used in restoration and also in native plant gardening, pollinator gardening. So there's a nice link there. That's Dalea ornata. If we just go a little bit farther south, Dalea cerealsii, that one just kind of more down south in the Great Basin. Same concept, same kind of floral form. I really like this. I think this is interesting. If we look at that big gap there, that's the Rocky Mountains. This is the Front Range. You can see where the Front Range is, right? And so basically we have a lot of Dalea in the short grass and tall grass prairies, but then they run into the Front Range and they're basically got to go around the back door or something like that. I'm going to highlight some of these tall grass prairie species later. So on our little tour, let's actually go down here. There's Dalea in Florida too. In fact, it's distributed. This is Dalea pinnata, distributed up along the Gulf and even into the Carolinas and coastal areas. But basically, these species are all growing in open areas, right? They're not going to grow under a dense forest canopy. They're going to be in a prairie, in an arid area, maybe in the ones in Florida are kind of scrublands or sandy areas. But you can see that all these have that same kind of floral form, like I talked about, probably a generalist, predicted to be generalist pollinated. Now let's go down. Let's keep going down all the way through Mexico, Central America. Now, isn't this cool? Does anyone recognize what this, what's being traced here? What is the Dalea following? Shout it out if you know it. The Andes Mountains, yeah. So let's go down to the Andes Mountains where I lived for a little bit. Let's go to Quito, Ecuador. Dalea caerulea. This is not my photo, but it is something that I saw there. You can see how it's more like a lupinus, the flowers look to me. Where the petals are enclosing the anthers. So an insect is going to have to be able to manipulate the flowers to be able to access them. Staying in Ecuador, of course, there's the Dalea endemic to the Galapagos, Dalea tenuicollis. I wasn't totally sure how to code this one because I only had these images from GBIF of herbarium vouchers. So I zoomed in as much as I could. I'm pretty sure it's this floral form, but I couldn't totally tell. I just wanted to highlight it though, because it's so cool that there's one that's endemic to the Galapagos. I think that's awesome. And now going down farther into the Andes, Dalea boliviana, which occurs in Bolivia, obviously. I picked this one to highlight because this species occurs at super high elevation. It occurs from all the way up to 13,000 feet in elevation. It can get that high. So, you think about Dalea pinnata down there in Florida, basically at sea level, and then we've got Dalea boliviana so high up. It's so cool. How high is Silver City? What elevation is Silver City? 6,000. And then the mountains surrounding us are at about what? Up to 10. So basically, you're still, I mean, Boliviana is like 8 to 13,000 is this range. It's just incredible. Most of the time when we're down south here, this is mostly this blue color-coded form, the specialist form. There are a couple of little orange dots here, though. Okay, so there are some generalists that are down there, like Dalea leporina. You can kind of see in this photo how the anthers are all exposed, and it's that dense spike inflorescence. Almost looks more like a plantago or something than a typical legume, or maybe it looks like a mimosa or an acacia or something. But it is down there. And so this is Dalea leporina. It does occur in Bolivia. I'll tell you that there is at least one other population of Dalea leporina in the map. Take a second. I'm not going to call you out this time, but take a second. Where else do you think Dalea leporina, this species, occurs?
It occurs in New Mexico.
Spoiler alert. No, it's okay. No, that's great. So let me cut to the chase here. That's quite the distribution. Into New Mexico, that's correct. Also even up into North Dakota and Minnesota. Think about that. It occurs in Bolivia and Minnesota. That's crazy. That's quite the distribution. Okay, so that was our little tour. But to conclude our tour, I'm interested in comparing these two floral forms. So where do we got to go? We have to zoom in on this interface right here where they're really kind of meeting each other and overlapping. Let's zoom in. I mean, this is just so, I love seeing this image. This is kind of like why I wanted to study this genus. And, this is why I wanted to come to the Sky Islands down in southeastern Arizona. And we can kind of draw the circle a little bit larger. That way Gila, Silver City's in there too. And it's just, well, that's why I wanted to come to this region. And that's why I think, it makes sense for me to talk to you guys tonight. Let's just take another second too to say that how many times have you heard about how New Mexico is so special because of the fact that we have this, we're at the, interface or overlap of all these different communities, all these different ecosystems we got the Rockies up here, and then we're close to the Sonoran Desert and the Chihuahua, like you've probably seen that all the time in a New Mexico thing. Well, even in the different floral forms of Dalea, we can see that New Mexico holds truly a special place. And I'll even say the Gila, holds a truly special place. Has anybody here ever seen any Dalea while you're walking around? Okay. Which ones have you seen? Formosa. Yeah, okay. That's a great one. What else?
I mentioned Dalea leporina. It's a wetland plant.
Yep. Okay, sweet. Has anybody ever?
There's other ones.
Yeah. Has anybody planted any of it in a pollinator garden or anything like that?
Yep.
Okay, which one did you plant?
The prairie one.
Okay, sweet. That's great. Okay, so that concludes my little intro section. And now we know a little bit more about, why generalist versus specialist comparisons are interesting, why Dalea is a great genus to explore this topic, and why this region here is a great region to talk about it and to check it out. But first, so my first little section here where I talk about my research is actually, the last one is down in the Southwest here, but the first one is going to be in the tall grass prairie. So let me take a sip of water and a quick little pause. If we think back to that map that I showed you, in the Midwest, we just have the open floral form generalist Dalea, right? But I realized I went to school in St. Louis, by the way, I should probably mention that. I realized that I had access to the Shaw Nature Reserve, that's where we're at right here, which has tall grass prairies, glades, and different forested areas, not too far outside of St. Louis. And I realized, well, okay, even though I only have the one floral form of Dalea, there's plenty of other legumes that are there that have the typical legume floral form, like this one, Baptisia alba, the white indigo. And so I could kind of start to make my comparisons there. And so I say, by the way, Dalea and Amorpha, what's going on here? Am I trying to pull a fast one? I included not just Dalea, but also this genus, Amorpha. This is Amorpha canescens, the lead plant. It's just such a gorgeous, classic prairie plant. I included this in my study because it's closely related to Dalea. Both Dalea and Amorpha are in the Amorphae tribe. And as we'll see here, here's my study species, studies pairs. You can see that these Amorpha also kind of have the same floral form where it's like a dense spike of flowers and there's a bunch of anthers exposed and everything like that. So what I did is I wanted one of this kind of floral form and then one of the typical legume floral form. And I just selected them. They both had to be abundant and blooming at the same time in the same region. So this is actually an invasive species. You've probably seen this one, the yellow sweet clover. And I'm comparing it to Amorpha frutescens, which is a shrub. Okay, the next pair, Amorpha canescens, the lead plant that I showed you a couple seconds ago, and Sorellidium tenuiflorum. You can see the same floral form, and these ones are open. Next pair, Dalea candida, white prairie clover. Look at all that pollen that she's got on her legs. Okay, and I compared that to Baptisia alba. And then last but not least, Dalea purpurea, the purple prairie clover. And this is just the white sweet clover, which is also non-native and invasive. Okay, so I studied these species, I compared their pollination systems. I asked, are these actually more generalist than these ones? Are these more specialist? And then I also asked about advantages and disadvantages as I mentioned earlier. So First off, yes, the open floral form did have a more generalist pollination system compared to the specialist. If we want to put numbers on, there's kind of a bunch of different ways you could slice and dice this. But if we want to put numbers on it, I collected pollinators, and then we can calculate what's called a Simpson's diversity index. And the bigger the number, the more diverse it is. It basically accounts for the abundance and number of different species. And every time this number is bigger than this number. So that's one way of saying, yes, these really did have kind of like more pollinator diversity, more generalized. Another way is just to say, well, like, what are the major taxonomic groups of insects that we're seeing? And in these generalist ones, you're seeing all kinds of stuff, bees, all kinds of bees, bumblebees, tiny little sweat bees, big bees, small bees, everything in between, wasps, plenty of wasps, even flies, beetles, so all kinds of stuff. Let me just go back to this beetle here. Oop. Choliognathus is the genus. It's in the Cantharidae. It's a soldier beetle. Okay, but it will absolutely visit and pollinate these flowers. In contrast, in contrast, these were strictly being pollinated by bees. So definitely more generalized pollination system. Okay, what about the advantages and disadvantages? There's a wealth of theory and hypotheses about what the advantages and disadvantages should be. And I tested many of them. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them, okay? So this is kind of a fun one. We're looking at the stigma of Dalea purpurea, where the pollen grains are being deposited, right, onto the stigma. And one prediction about generalized plants with generalized pollination systems is that they might end up receiving a bunch of pollen from the wrong plant, right? And we can kind of see that here, right? These grains here are Dalea pollen grains. Okay, they're all deflated here, but these are Dalea pollen grains on Dalea purpurea. Okay, makes sense. But what's this? That's from the sunflower family. That's from the Asteraceae family, and that's not going to, make a seed, obviously. So this could potentially be a bad thing. This could be a disadvantage of being a generalist pollination system because, well, for one thing, they could just take up too much space on the stigma. Sometimes they could even be allelopathic, like releasing harmful chemicals. Okay, so were the generalist species more likely to receive heterospecific pollen? Yes, they were. Pretty decidingly so. On the y-axis, we're measuring how many. I collected these. I collected like the stigmas, the entire style actually. And I looked at them under fluorescence microscopy. That's what's going on here. And I counted how many of the stigmas had, heterospecific, like foreign, different from a different species pollen grains. And in every case, well, pretty much every case, the black bar, which is the generalist species, is much higher than the gray bar, which is the specialist species. And so this prediction of a disadvantage of the generalist species was pretty strongly true. Okay, why did they have so many other pollen grains? You might think that the reason why it could be because, like I was saying before, an insect visits not just you, but all these other things, right? But it turns out that when I washed the pollen grains off of the insects after I collected them and then stained them using Calabarillus fluid here, this is Dalea purpurea, I'm pretty sure, and this is, again, one of those sunflower type species. It wasn't actually the case that the pollen loads that were on the insects' bodies differed. By the way, shout out to Diane for giving the talk last month, and also whoever scheduled this. Diane probably covered, like, you guys have great background to know what I'm talking about here. But when an insect visits, maybe they're carrying no pollen at all. Maybe they're carrying this or that. Well, so how do these two things make sense together? Why were the generalists so likely to have heterospecific pollen, even though the insects that were visiting them were not more likely to be carrying heterospecific pollen compared to the specialist ones? I'll show you why I think it is. Let's check out this wasp visiting Dalea candida, white prairie clover. This is, I think, in the genus Myzenum, this wasp. There are a lot of wasps that like to visit flowers, as I think Diane talked about last month. And just look at its behavior. It's just wrapping itself around the flower and engorging itself in the nectar. And so the pollen that's in the anthers and the stigmas, which are kind of right inside there too, it's just all kind of mixed together. There's no precision to the contact between the insect and the parts of the flower. But now let's check out how it happens in a legume. What happens here, this bee visited this flower, it's got to push open, it's got to manipulate the petals to access the nectar that's in there. And when that happens, then the sexual organs, the anthers and the stigma get, they contact a specific part of the bee's body. This is actually the kudzu, which is this super invasive vine in the southeast. Which we have it in Missouri. It wasn't one of my study species, but I did help other people who were studying it down there. And this is the giant resin bee, Megachile sculpturalis. It's huge, and it's also non-native. It's also from Asia. But I chose this photo because I feel like, if I'm trying to explain imprecise contact versus precise, I think a picture tells the story better than I could. So we could imagine here, if we're looking at these two bees, let's say that this bee visits a generalist flower and this bee visits a specialist flower, and they both end up having three types of pollen. They have the pollen of the species they're actually visiting there, and then plus two other species. In the generalist one, it's just like this, just kind of scattered all over the dorsal, the underside part, the ventral part of the insect's body. But maybe when it visits the specialist flower, then it ends up in a specific location. Okay. That is the end of section 2. I'm going to take another sip of water because we're going to come down to the Sky Islands to wrap things up here. I should mention that like I said, I tested all sorts of other hypotheses. That one that we just saw, it kind of matched the prediction. People would predict that a generalist species would maybe have more foreign pollen grains on it, and that matched the prediction. But some of the ones that I tested, it was actually the opposite of what was predicted, which was kind of interesting. Like with this type of generalist species actually had less nectar robbers, that is, insects that visit but don't actually carry any pollen on them, and they drink nectar. These had less of those nectar robbers compared to this type of species, because actually a lot of times butterflies would just like land on the thing and then like stick their proboscis and drink without actually picking up any pollen. Plenty to talk about, but I just don't have time for all those tonight. Okay, let's go to the Sky Islands. This is in southeastern Arizona. This is called the Appleton Whittle Research Ranch, which is near Elgin, Arizona. It's like if you're in Sierra Vista and you go to the west, or if you're in Tucson and you go to the south, very close to the border with Mexico. Very popular with birding. And this, in this grassland, I found some Dalea species that I studied during the monsoon season. I also did some work up in the mountains in the Chiricahua National Forest by Portal, Arizona, where the Southwest Research Station is located. And so this was kind of nice because I kind of got to be up in the mountains where there's actual rain happening. And then down here, you want to know something that's really hard? Trying to time your field trip to the monsoons when you live in St. Louis, Missouri, and you want to come down. It's like you got to have not just the plants but the pollinators too. So it was kind of, despite the fact that there's so many Dalea species down here, timing it is not so easy. Okay, but that's kind of why I had multiple locations also. Okay, so and here's what I ended up focusing on, because they were abundant and blooming at the same time. That's my critical criteria. They have to be blooming at the same time, in the same location, abundance, that kind of thing. So I had Dalea albifloras in both locations, actually, down in the Madrean grassland and up in the mountains. And then in the grassland, I had Dalea nana was flowering. And in the mountains, I had Dalea filiformis, which is tiny, 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 tiny plant. And I asked the same questions that I did in the previous section. So first off, once again, no matter how you slice it or dice it, Dalea albiflora had a much more generalist pollination system compared to these two. I mean, look at this, 0.948. It ranges from 0 to 1, by the way, to scale. I mean, the most generalist you could be would be a 1. And then, I mean, this is a 0. I only collected one species, one taxa of bee Anthophora at Dalea nana. And then once again, here's a little bit closer, but still pretty strong. And just like last time, we have a bunch of different taxonomic groups visiting Dalea albiflora, and we just had bees at these two. Okay, let's see some of the pollinators on Dalea albiflora. Let's see some of that diversity. Once again, I mean, how cool is that? Remember this beetle, this soldier beetle that we saw in the tall grass prairies, pollinating a Morpha fruticosa in that case? And even down here in the Southwest, we have, it's a different species, but it's the same genus and the same concept. I thought that was just so cool. And, different, all kinds of different bees. These are just some of them, flies even, and wasps. Speaking of wasps, look who I saw at Dalea albiflora. This is the tarantula hawk, I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken. And it found time out of its busy schedule to take a break from killing tarantulas and come pollinate Dalea albiflora. It was so awkward though with those long legs. I mean, it was like, I have a series of like 10 photos of just the whole process, and it was not very elegant, but it happened. Yeah, Dalea nana really did not have any pollinators. I only collected one taxa bee. I did manage to get a photo of another bee though. This is, I think, Anthidium, I think is the genus. So I mean, there were other things out there, but just not super common. And you can see, I don't know. You can see the difference in the floral display as well, right? There's only a couple of flowers open compared to albiflora, which has a really impressive floral display. It makes sense that they would be able to attract more things. One other thing I want to quickly say, Filiformis, I didn't get any photos for you, but it was mostly pollinated by this really tiny bee in the genus Ashmediella, which is in the Megachilidae. It's like it's in the family of the leafcutter bees, but it's just like a really tiny little bee. And so that was pretty cool because Dalea filiformis has really, really tiny flowers. I mean, even smaller than Dalea nana. But what also was cool was that that bee, that Ashmediella that would go to filiformis, it would also go to albiflora. In fact, it liked going to albiflora. There's a higher abundance of it at albiflora compared to this one. So this one really only attracted one bee basically, and it wasn't even more attractive to that one bee compared to albiflora. That's not necessarily matching some of the predictions of why a specialist would have an advantage. Okay, so let's continue with let's pose this question again. We already learned about this, right? Did that pattern hold true? Do the stigmas of the general species receive more heterospecific pollen? Yes, so this is consistent in the tallgrass prairie and in the sky islands of the Southwest, and with different species involved. And here was even more strong. I mean, these Filiformis and nana pretty much didn't get any heterospecific pollen, but Dalea albiflora, of course, did. What about something else, though? So this is kind of the last little consideration that we need to think about. What if the plants don't actually need pollinators at all? Some flowers could just automatically self-pollinate, and they don't. We shouldn't make the assumption that they need pollinators in the first place. I'll tell you that in the tallgrass prairie in Missouri, none of those species self-pollinated. Okay, I checked for that there, but none of those 8 taxa that I showed you were self-pollinating. But I'm bringing it up here. Now, this is up in the Chiricahua, and here's where I found Dalea filiformis. I mean, blanking, you'll miss it. Like, you got to really know what you're looking for. And albiflora was right in the mixer, too. So I got tool veil, like bridal veil, and you cut it, and then you get some yarn, and you tie it over the flowers, over the inflorescence before they open, so that pollinators can't visit them. And then we're going to compare that to individuals where I didn't exclude pollinators. We're going to kind of see the difference between the two. And we can do that using that same fluorescence microscopy. At the stigma, little quick intro botany lesson here, but the stigma, okay, is the top of the female parts of the flower, basically. And so here we can see the pollen grains landing on the stigma. And then the pollen grains actually germinate and grow a tube that goes down to the ovary, potentially, to fertilize the ovules, the ovules are going to become the seeds, the things that look like little kidney beans. Okay, and you can even count these. Like, I could even count how many pollen tubes made it into the style, how many of them made it to the ovule here to fertilize it. I think this one's actually just kind of wrapping around it rather than entering the ovule, but you get the idea. So let's see, who was self-pollinating, who wasn't. Well, our generalist, Dalea albiflora, did not self-pollinate at all. Okay, here we're measuring. I'm just showing you how many grains were deposited on the stigma, but the same is true when we look further and further down. Dalea albiflora in white, those are the ones that were unbagged, okay, that were exposed to pollinators, and the gray ones were with that bridal veil over them. So Dalea albiflora, if you bag it, you don't let pollinators come, it's not going to self-pollinate, right? And if you expose it to pollinators, well, then it does a great job because it's so popular. But Dalea nana, whoa, look at this. If you expose it to pollinators, this is what you get. But if you just bag it and don't let any pollinators come, whoa, it's doing quite a bit of self-pollination. And this is even more extreme for Dalea filiformis. I mean, Dalea filiformis, it doesn't even really, those few little ash meaty yellow bees, they might bring some pollen from another individual, but they're doing a lot of self-pollination themselves. And so this is really cool to me because, you know, you think about, like I said, I just picked these species because I needed the two floral forms, same place, same time kind of a thing. And in this very, you guys know how it is down here where everything can be so unpredictable with the rains and what's going to be available and the timing of everything. I thought it was so cool that this, you know, in some ways they're so different. This has Dalea albiflora has a super generalist pollination system and it doesn't self-pollinate. And then these two have a really, when they do get pollinators, it's very specialized, but they do a lot of automatic self-pollination. These are almost like the two opposite ends of the spectrum. Couldn't be any more different, right? But then I realized actually in some ways they're very similar. And the way that they're similar is that both of these strategies could evolve in response to an uncertain pollinator environment. Okay, so if you have pollen limitation, which I just mean, you know, there's kind of not enough pollen, or maybe I should say pollinator limitation would maybe be more accurate, not enough pollinators around, that plants might evolve to just reproduce vegetatively, right? They say, I'm not making flowers anymore, I don't care, I'm just gonna spread through rhizomes and like a vine and stuff like that. Okay, you could, if pollinators are kind of uncertain, you could have, well, I'm just gonna let anything in, right? I don't want to specialize, I don't want to take my chances, you know, I'm gonna take anything I can get. Or you might say, you know what, I'm just gonna do it myself, and I'm just gonna self-pollinate like these two. And then here's another possible strategy, like you could live a really long time. Oh, I had a bad year, but maybe next year will be better. So really, I just think it's so cool that both of these vastly different systems actually could be really similar in this sense. To be clear, I'm not arguing that all of these type of Dalea are that they never self-pollinate. Maybe some of them do, right? I mean, you saw the map, right? There's 200 species. And I'm also not saying that all of this type of Dalea are selfers. Like I don't think Dalea formosa is a selfer because it has a pretty big showy flower and it does, you know, kind of attract things. But the ones that I found that were exposed to that same environment had strategies to account for uncertain pollinator environment. Last slide here, bonus slide. Because you made it so bravely to the end here, we're going to give you a bonus slide. You know, I've talked all about the flowers of Dalea and the pollination because it makes sense. The pollination systems are so cool and they have such different flowers. But Dalea is a really interesting genus beyond what I've talked about today. Dalea has glands on their underside of their leaves, especially sometimes on the stem. And I can tell you from experience that I would, when I was out there, I would break the leaves and smell, you know, to see what kind of scents I would get. Sometimes you would get like a pine scent or sometimes a citrus scent, and other times like a really acrid, kind of nasty scent. Like I think Dalea lacnosteacus might have been guilty of that. But this is also important for understanding the evolution of these species, their ecological interactions, and also, you know, where they are going forward, you know, into the future with what types of interactions they're going to have. In fact, if you look up research into Dalea on Google Scholar, you're going to see a bunch of examples of people extracting various compounds from all sorts of different Dalea species, and maybe it's an antifungal, or maybe it's a this, or maybe a that. So this is a really important piece of the puzzle. When you're out there this summer looking for Dalea, right? That's your job now. I want you to, you know, look at the flowers. I want you to look at the pollinators if they're there visiting the flowers. And I want you to also look for the glands if you see them, because it's a really, I went there to study pollination, but I was blown away by the glands. Okay, thank you. And thanks to everyone for attending. Funding sources, in particular, I want to highlight Arizona Native Plant Society. I received the Jenny Saylor research grant to do the work in Arizona there. And so, I mean, we're at the New Mexico Native Plant Society here. I know you guys administer grants as well. It's just such a huge thing that these native plant societies do. I would not have been able to do this research without them. And I wouldn't be able to be telling you about it tonight if it weren't for the Native Plant Society. So shout out to the Arizona Native Plant Society and to any Native Plant Society that there is. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions.
This was a 10-year project?
No, this is like I just did it for my PhD, which lasted 5 years, and I made 2 trips to Arizona. The first one though, I didn't get much data. I got data on a bunch of different species, but it'd be like, oh, there's 2 individuals of Dalea formosa, and there's two individuals of Dalea pogonathra, you know. So I wasn't able to get a robust data set. That was in 2014. That was like the trial run. The second time in 2015, I returned and I had a better kind of strategy of how to deal with everything. So basically, you know, I think both in terms of the amount of species I was able to study, but also the length of time that I was able to study them for, I would like to know more for sure. Yeah. The 10-year study, if you read that in the little blurb about me, that's about my current position with Penn State, where we have a 10-year study involving forests and deer, basically.
What are the functions of the spores or whatever on the different leaves? Is that like with cactus where it respirates and it can drop or take in moisture? What does it do?
My guess is that they're anti-herbivory, like they're trying to keep insects and things from munching on them.
So
But
it emits.
yeah, I mean, you can smell it pretty strongly. I mean, it's some of these smell really bitter and nasty. So
We've got a Zoom question.
okay,
Donna Stevens is asking, I'm wondering if the genus Dalea is unusual in having both generalist and specialist pollinators. Is it partly a function of being a large genus?
yeah, I think that being a large genus definitely helps because when you have so many species, it's like every species is a chance for something different to happen, right? So I think that being a large genus and having a wide distribution probably helps. But there are other genera that have generalist and specialist pollination systems within the same genus. I'm not sure if those other ones were Dalea is pretty large. So there are certainly genera that don't have as many species as Dalea, but also that have a mixture of systems. Yeah, it reminds me too, by the way, speaking of mixtures, you know, I portrayed it as these 2 different types of flowers, one or the other, like a binary thing. And for the most part, that's true. But there are some species like Dalea lacnostachys. If you see the flower of this one, it looks like the typical specialist legume floral form, the banner petal, the wing petals, and the keel petal, except that the anthers and the stigma are exposed beyond the keel petals aren't actually enclosing anything. So there's even variation beyond what I've told you tonight. Okay, other questions? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was curious about the sweet clovers that you studied. I mean, they're invasive, they're not native here. How can they be a specialist? I mean, all we ever found on them was basically honeybees.
Yeah.
So is that what you found as well?
That's what I found as well. And I guess what I would say is a couple of things. Number one, when I set out to pick my species, I just wanted to pick like, okay, well, I'm in a glade. I just want native glade species because having a non-native species in the mix adds a wrinkle that I didn't really want. But I prioritized I wanted species that were really common and all blooming at the same time because that's kind of the most important thing. And then it's like, well, sounds invasive, but whatever. So I guess what I would say is that, the whole generalist specialist thing, in terms of how I'm approaching it here, it's more just like a relative question. If you have 2 types of flowers that are in the same environment at the same time, so they both have a chance to be sampling from the available available mix of pollinators that are there, how does this one do compared to this one? Kind of a thing. So it's not so much a specialist, in terms of, Darwin's orchid or something like that, right? It's more just like, which one has a higher diversity of insects or whatever that it's sampling from the available environment. And then if I have multiple pairs of that, can I start to see patterns emerge, basically? But certainly, yeah, I was not thrilled with studying those species, but I made it work, basically.
I was actually gonna ask the exact same question.
Oh, wow.
Invasive data, confounding some of the results, and also on the flip side, honeybees, maybe Lotus wouldn't even be here for this. Because, and honeybees will beat up native pollinators and push them away.
Right.
Change, what you get on.
Yeah, again, I think the critical thing, everything that you're saying, I agree with, basically. And I think the critical thing from like an experimental design approach is just, that's why you have to have multiple replicates, right? If I just have this species and this one, oh, well, maybe that's just because of the Lotus. But if that's, basically what I would describe it as is like noise in the data set, right? But if you have multiple pairs, and then, even multiple locations, the prairie, but also the glade, and then, Missouri, but also Arizona.
Yeah.
Then at a certain point, you don't want to put too much faith into one observation or one set of observations. But if you have a bunch of different observations and the arrows are kind of all pointing in the same direction, then you can be a little bit more confident. But I think I would have been more worried if, because I also just asked questions about like, well, which one, if the specialists are specialized on bees, then do they attract a higher abundance of bees? But usually they didn't. Usually, Dalea purpurea, purple prairie clover, was attracting a super high abundance of bees. So I think if the invasive species was always just getting a ton of huge abundance of bees, then I'd be like, oh, what can I really conclude from this? But because of the fact that actually Dalea purpurea and had no trouble outperforming Lotus in that context.
And watch out for taxonomists though, because they're gonna chop this genus in half. And then it'll be too general.
But it used to be. Sorry, I should have said that. So these, well, whatever. I'm not going to go all the way back, but the generalist Dalea, many of them used to be in the genus Petalostemon.
Okay.
But Shelley McMahon at the University of Arizona, she did some phylogenetic studies of them, evolutionary studies, tree of life, using DNA, and found that actually basically those generalist ones, they lost the specialized floral form. It was a shift from specialization to generalization, which is also not common, and that happened probably multiple times. Probably the amorpha, like the lead plant and stuff I was showing you, is also an independent one as well. So it's like there's this thing where they're kind of saying, yeah, you know what, I don't think I want to specialize anymore. Just give me anything I can get, kind of a thing. I saw a hand back this way.
I'm wondering how confident you are about the pollinators when you study, you actually captured the full suite. And did you consider nighttime pollinators like moths?
Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, I'm sure they did not capture the full suite, because well, these species have broad ranges, and I'm only going out there 1 year or 2 years, 2 or 3 years, something like that. So I'm sure that there's a lot more out there. But again, to address that, it's just once again kind of like when I was answering Diane's question, where it's like, it's not so much that I'm trying to argue that I know everything about who's pollinating what. It's more like this type of flower relative to this one. And if I put the same sampling effort into, 20 minutes collecting insects on this one, then 20 minutes collecting, if I put the same sampling effort into the two of them, then I should be able to make comparisons between the two. Even if I don't know the full suite, probably there's more out there that I didn't get.
That's cool. I appreciate that. But you've really piqued my curiosity. And so I'm wondering, like, with in the tall grass prairie, the olive, which is so tall and so white, is this attracting nighttime insects.
Maybe, I did sometimes go out at night, just to see if I observed anything, basically to determine if it was worth the effort. And I think I went out like once or twice and didn't see anything. I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. I can get enough data just during the daytime, and maybe I'm missing something, but but maybe I'm just wasting, I gotta sleep sometime too, so. Yeah,
There was too much full moon and I'm, blanketing over, trying to get.
I think in the case of Baptisia alba, that white wild indigo, that tall one in the tall grass prairie with those beautiful white flowers, it's hard to imagine a moth. At nighttime up there would be moths, and it's hard to imagine a moth pollinating one of those flowers because it might be able to stick its tongue down into where the nectar is, but it's probably not. I mean, who knows? But it's probably not gonna push the petals to expose the anthers and the stigma, like when I showed you that giant resin bee at the kudzu. It's got to actually physically kind of open it. I don't think a hawk moth would be able to do that, but yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of curious about those glands in the different scents.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, has anybody ever studied, why would there be different scents? Are an evolution going on of deterrent against a specific predators or insects?
Yeah. So
Have you ever tapped into that? It sounds pretty interesting.
I'm going to lay all my cards on the table here. And I just want to go back to, of course, one of the very first slides I showed you, but yeah, here. So remember when I showed you this structure? This is a typical structure of a plant pollinator network where the interactions are mutual. It's a mutualistic thing. The plant benefits from it and the pollinator benefits from it too. They both benefit, at least they should. And they tend to have these asymmetric, highly nested networks. But in a plant herbivore interaction, that's an antagonistic interaction. The herbivore, the little insect, benefits from it because it gets a meal, but the plant doesn't benefit. It gets harmed, right? So if these different chemicals that are in the glands are to somehow deal with herbivory, then we could basically use the genus Dalea to test the two hypotheses, the hypotheses about this structure of this type of mutualistic network, but then the antagonistic networks have a different structure where they become more compartmentalized and more specialists interacting with specialists, basically. So that's one thing that could be done. There's also questions about rates of speciation, like if you have your tree of life or your phylogenetic tree, your tree of life, but just for Dalea. And where is the branching? Where is there more branching? Where is there higher rates of speciation? And is that associated with pollination? Sometimes people think, oh, okay, well, you get your species that's pollinated by the hummingbird and your species that's pollinated by the bee. So speciation could be driven by pollination, right? But speciation could also be driven by, I just want to avoid this herbivore, so I'm going to make this chemical.
Okay.
And I just want to avoid this herbivore, so I'm going to make this chemical. So Dalea, because it's got those glands, but also the interesting pollination situation, you could kind of test which is more important in terms of driving speciation in the genus. So, there's a lot, like if somebody just gave me a ton of money right now and said, do whatever you want.
I got you.
That would be one of the things that I would like to do. Yeah.
This is not on your point, but that map showing the distribution, it looked like North America. Has anyone done any research on the evolution and, did it like start in North America and spread down to Latin America, or,
As of when I finished my PhD in 2017, and I started doing different stuff after that. As of then, no, not that I'm aware of. Now, maybe in the last 10 years, somebody has. But once again, that's another thing that I spent so much time thinking about, I still think about. If you give me even more money, I think probably when I talk to people, sometimes people think the center of diversity probably in Mexico. You have a lot of species. There's probably even more. These maps are incomplete. So probably around here is the center of diversity where you have the most species and you have overlap of both kinds. And so maybe that's where it originated and then spread out from there to there. But that would just be a hypothesis. That would be great to test. Believe me, that's something I would love to know. I thought about it during my PhD all the time, and I still think about it. I think both of you have great instincts for scientific thought. Other questions? Yeah.
If I had time and money, and I don't, that I could give you, as you are getting familiar with New Mexico, we have a ton of astragalus species in the state.
Yeah.
Are you aware of has anyone done any similar research looking at generalist versus specialist and given?
My understanding of astragalus, and you tell me if I'm wrong here, please. But to me, astragalus just has this type of flower. I don't know of any astragalus species where they have their anthers and where they have a really open floral form.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that there can't, remember what I said earlier, where it's kind of all relative, right? I mean, in some senses, both of these types are specialists in that they specialize on insects, right? And if something was pollinated by a hummingbird and a bee and a butterfly, well, that would be even more generalized than my most generalist one, right? So it's possible that I'm sure that there is some sort of continuum of generalization versus specialization, even in something like astragalus, which just has these kind of flowers. But I don't know that there are any of these kind of super generalist type flowers in that genus. But I mean, you can see variation, like when you have, like, even if this type of flower, it's really teeny tiny, there's not, you're pretty much just going to get teeny tiny bees going to that. You're not going to get like a big carpenter bee. It's not going to waste its time there. So you could still have a continuum of generalization versus specialization, even in something like astragalus. Yeah.
That made me think about, astragalus has a lot of very rare species. Are any of the dahlias, are they rare versus common?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Dalea purpurea and Dalea candida, like this is their distribution, yeah. So they are super common. The purple prairie clover and the white prairie clover, super common. But I mean, well, okay, the endemic one in Galapagos is kind of rare. It's maybe a little bit of maybe it's like a technicality. Yeah, it's not what you're talking about. There's Dalea gangerii, which is kind of rare. It looks basically exactly like the purple prairie clover, but it occurs just in some glades in like Tennessee. And so it's probably well, I don't know, but probably it used to have a wider distribution. And then everything kind of, the forest kind of filled in around it and it could hang on in the glades. But so there's certainly, and I mean, in Mexico, there's all kinds of stuff. So there's absolutely gradients between, Dalea leporina, right? Versus, some that are just reported from some tiny little canyon in wherever, Sonora.
Do they break up into, like, would they be more likely, if they're rare, to be more likely to be specialist? Have you ever looked at that?
Ooh, that's something that I totally think is really interesting. You would predict that these ones would not be as rare, right? Because they should probably be better at reproducing, if that's the only thing that matters. There's certainly a lot of kind of rare or rare-ish ones with this form in Mexico, but I never know if that's just because they're undercollected. I mean, like, you can kind of, like, we see it tracing the Andes, right? And then we kind of see them tracing the Sierra Madre. So in some senses, this gap kind of makes sense, but I also just think I think there's just way more there than have been collected. Of course, if they're selfing, then they might not be rare. So if I could have the perfect phylogeny, know everything about their pollinators, know everything about their phytochemicals, know everything about if they're selfing or not, then we could seriously answer all the questions. But that would take a lot of money. Great questions, though. I love the way everybody's thinking about this. Any other questions? Questions from online? No? Okay.